the Friends of Fondren board members and very proud former student of Dr. Huston. And I am mainly here to introduce my fellow introducers, so I'm going to keep it short tonight because everybody wants to hear from Dr. Huston. I'd like to introduce my fellow board member, Victor Benavides, and a partner in reading, and a member of my little flock of owls these days. Victor.
Thank you, Natalie, and good evening. On behalf of Friends of Fondren Library, thank you for joining us at the Books That Shape My World. My name is Victor Benavides. I'm on the Friends of Fondren Library board, and I'm proud to welcome our speaker, Professor Emeritus J. Dennis Huston, the Gladys Louise Fox Professor Emeritus of English. Professor Huston received his BA at Wesleyan University and earned his master's and PhD at Yale University. He began teaching at Rice in 1969 and retired in 2017. In his time here, he has published, edited, taught, and won numerous superior teaching awards and accolades, including the George R. Brown Award for Superior Teaching, an impressive 4 times. In 1989, the Carnegie Foundation named Huston the nation's Professor of the Year. In 1990, Houston Metropolitan Magazine named him one of the 90 best things about Houston. Professor Huston is the past president of Rice's Beta of Texas chapter of Pi Beta Kappa and has served on the Pi Beta Kappa Alumni Association of Greater Houston's board of directors since 1999. He also served as Hanson College Magister from 1978 to 1982 and again from 1992 to 1998. He taught Shakespeare's works in the classroom and was a frequent actor in Shakespearean productions around campus. In 2017, Rice Magazine interview, he named A Midsummer Night's Dream as his favorite Shakespeare comedy. Former Rice Humanities Dean Nicholas Shumway recognized a course with Dennis is not simply a course that ends at a certain time. It is the beginning of a dialogue that lasts a lifetime. We are looking forward to listening to this dialogue with Professor Huston on how books have shaped his view of the world. We will have a short question and answer period after the lecture as well as a reception, so we hope that you'll join us for that. Please help me and welcome Dennis Huston to tonight's event. Dr. Huston, we're glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much. Let me begin with an apology of sorts. In thinking about this talk, I considered many books that I'm not going to discuss this evening. Books like Childhood and Society, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Worldly Philosophers, and my favorite sports book, The Boys of Summer. Such works may very well have shaped my world as much as the ones I will be talking about this evening. But as an English teacher, I feel much more comfortable talking about novels. So that is what I decided to do tonight, with apologies to all of you who think that the scope of my subject is too narrow. It may be, but it is what I know how to do best, so I decided on what seemed to me the most manageable option available. This talk is also a kind of limited autobiography, a journey into the self shaped by a lifetime of reading. So here I go. The single most important thing I can say about myself, at least for purposes of this talk, is that I was lucky enough as a child to be read to by my mother from a very early age that extended all the way through 8th grade. My childhood then is significantly shaped both by the books she read to me and by those that I, of course, later read myself. My mother had been a high school English teacher who had also been an amateur actress, so she read really well. As a result, books came alive for me very early in my life. I remember particularly from my first years the stories of Little Toot and the Little Engine That Could, both of whom successfully overcame huge challenges by effort, determination, and real courage in the face of defeat. Partly because my mother read these stories so often and with such feeling, these characters, who were more to me than just a tugboat and a train engine, became models whose lessons I believed in deeply and never forgot. In a way, they have been my heroes all my life. Much they taught me can be gained by persistence, effort, determination, hard work, and courage in the face of defeat. I remember also from those early years my mother reading me Winnie the Pooh and The House at Pooh Corner. And what I loved about these books was the personalities of the different characters, who were, of course, actually his stuffed animals, of Pooh, Piglet, Tigger, Rabbit, and his relations, and unforgettably, of the grumpy but entertaining Eeyore. These animals were all different, but each of them was unique and taught me very early in my life that people who were not like me had characteristics that made them interesting and worth knowing. From the time when my mother began reading to me, I learned not only that books told wonderful stories, but that they also contained fascinating worlds and people, which is why, when I was 5 years old and had not yet learned how to read, I remember vividly standing in front of a large bookshelf in our living room and thinking, someday I'll be able to read all these books. In October of that same year, shortly after my 6th birthday, I have a clear memory of a truly magical moment. In class, we had been learning the sounds of all the letters in the alphabet, a kind of fun activity, when I suddenly realized how these sounds could fit together into words. In this moment of sudden revelation, I could read. What my mother had long done for me and continued to do 4 nights a week for many years, I now could suddenly do for myself, which expanded my world enormously. For the first time, I could read during the day whenever I wasn't in school or playing games or sports with friends. Sometimes, too, I read at night after I was supposed to be asleep, using a flashlight under the covers. I did that, of course, because I could not wait to find out what was happening in the book that I had been reading earlier in the day. For books provided me with a world full of people, places, action, events, and surprises that was often more interesting than the constricting world I lived in. During my 3rd or 4th grade year, I began reading the Hardy Boy mysteries, to which I became addicted, partly because I identified with Frank and Joe, and partly because I was fascinated by the way they worked out solutions to the misdeeds they were investigating. Of course, the Hardy Boys were simplistic books written for relatively young readers, mostly boys. I never, for instance, read the Nancy Drew mysteries, because at that age I thought boys did not read books focused on girls. How things changed for me, though, as I grew older, will be clear when I finally talk about the book that will be my final focus this evening, because it is simply my favorite novel, the one I reread for fun almost every year and love to teach. That book is Pride and Prejudice. Why that is so, I will explain eventually. But let me return now to the Hardy Boys and to the world of detective fiction that these two brothers ushered me into. As someone who got so much pleasure reading about how the Hardy Boys solved mysteries, it was perfectly natural a few years later for me to become fascinated by Sherlock Holmes, who made an art of finding logical explanations that only he could see for much more complex mysteries than those the Hardy Boys confronted. And a good deal later than that, during the time that I began to teach at Rice, I started reading mystery stories late at night as a way of escaping from the pressures of balancing my work, full of class preparation, endless paper grading, and scholarly research, as well as a lot of bloody letters, with the challenges of family life, which were also included in all that I was in some way escaping from late at night. For someone who had once found the Hardy Boys and then Sherlock Holmes irresistible, it was a short metaphorical journey to spend escape time with writers like Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Dick Francis. These writers I read compulsively. In fact, I vividly remember reading in my study late at night an Agatha Christie novel as a reward for having had a good day working on a draft of what would eventually become an essay on the taming of the shrew. There was a problem, though, with this escape into detective fiction for me. Because I had become an academician, I felt guilty about spending so much time reading books that I was not putting to any productive work-related use. For this reason, I began to tell myself that I was reading all this fun stuff as a kind of incipient preparation for teaching. Someday, I assured my guilty conscience, I would teach a course in detective fiction. For a time, however, this thought was just a rationalization that allowed me to keep reading detective fiction late at night. But eventually, I began to plan such a course by thinking about how the different novels I had read fit into general categories, by reading scholarly articles and books about detective fiction, and by selecting which novels I would focus on when I actually did teach such a class. What I learned from this sort of preparation, a basic idea that eventually shaped my course, was that there are essentially two kinds of detective fiction, English and American. This idea is, of course, obviously overgeneralized, and there are English people who write American detective fiction in the sense that I'm going to talk about. But it does provide a useful entry into the subject. The traditional English detective novel, as practiced by Agatha Christie, though her work contains an occasional outlier like The Pale Horse, which is in fact my favorite Christie novel, focuses on a group of people gathered together for some kind of celebration, like a birthday party. In this closed world that contains a limited number of suspects, one of these celebrants is murdered, and the murderer and the motive for the crime must be uncovered. Rarely the murders, and even more rarely the murderers, multiply. But that kind of Christie novel is an exception to the general rule. Often in her work, too, the detective who solves and explains the crime, usually by asking questions of all the people assembled at the event, is Hercule Poirot, a physically unimpressive but intellectually brilliant outsider. One of the more interesting things about Agatha Christie's novels is that in them, the detective almost never faces real danger from the killer. Because Poirot's questions seem misguided and irrelevant, almost no one, including the murderer, takes him seriously as a detective. Instead, he seems silly. Someone who may once have been successful at solving murders, but who has since become cognitively impaired and ridiculously self-important. As a result, the killer almost never feels any need to kill him. The crime in this kind of work, then, is essentially a puzzle to be solved, rather than a dangerous threat to the detective seeking to identify the killer. This characteristic of the form is, however, not altogether convincing, because even if the detective's questions seemed irrelevant to the assembled group of suspects and to the reader, they would not seem irrelevant to the killer, who could more easily comprehend their significance, since that killer would know all about the apparently unimportant but actually crucial details of the crime. One example of such a detail in Christie's novels is that the killer sometimes disguises the time when the murder occurred in order to hide his or her involvement in the crime. Poirot's questions about time, that nobody apparently thinks are important, would therefore alert the killer to possible discovery and so make Poirot the murderer's next victim. But in Christie's work, the detective almost always remains safely ensconced behind the veil of apparent silliness. The same problem, though, does not exist in the American examples of this form. For in these novels, the detective and the world he moves in are very different from what we encounter in Christie's and in many other English writers' works. The American hard-boiled detective, as he has come to be known, operates in a world where violence is everywhere, and it directs itself against him not long after he begins his quest. And a quest it is, about which I will have more to say in a moment. The writer, acknowledged as the founder of this form, at least in America, or in novels, Poe did it before Hammett, is Dashiell Hammett, perhaps best known for The Maltese Falcon and for the tough, laconic, cynical detective Sam Spade. But the author who writes the classic example of American detective fiction is Raymond Chandler, whose first and best known novel, The Big Sleep, appeared 9 years after The Maltese Falcon. It appeared in 1939, Chandler's work. Chandler's book, I think, provides the model for the American detective's quest and for the world in which it occurs. In this novel, a detective, Philip Marlowe, who makes a minimal living, $25 a day, though remember this is 1939, as a private investigator, is hired to find someone or something that has gone missing. About that person in The Big Sleep, Marlowe learns basic information from his client, a dying old man who hires him. But very shortly after the detective begins his search, his quest for truth, he directly encounters chaos in the world around him. Someone he has met casually is soon murdered, and then the murders begin to multiply. Perhaps these deaths relate to the missing person, but perhaps they happen irrationally for no clear reason. They may simply result from the violence in the world that the detective has entered. For instance, when screenwriters were shaping a movie script for The Big Sleep, they could not figure out who had murdered one of the characters in the novel. So they telegrammed Raymond Chandler and asked him, "Who killed Geiger's chauffeur?" Chandler wired back, "I haven't the faintest idea." What authors say about their work is always suspect, as Robert Frost's purposely bland remarks about his poems have made clear. And Chandler may have been doing here what Frost did regularly, refusing to penetrate beneath the surface of his work. For this reason, I think Chandler knew exactly who committed the murder, but he enjoyed the fact that even careful readers of The Big Sleep could not always make sense of the violence in it, which was exactly Chandler's point. For the world of his novel is so irrational that violence can break out almost anywhere and at any time, without any clear explanation or understandable motivation. For example, when Philip Marlowe eventually completes his quest that proves circular by returning to where it began in the mansion of his client, he explains, not to the client, but to the family, he explains the murder of the missing person. The killer he identifies turns out to be the client's near moronic but sexy daughter, who shot her sister's husband simply because he rejected her casual sexual advances. And as further proof of the irrationality of this violent world, the sister to whom the victim was married hires someone to bury the body in an oil sump so that her old and dying father won't learn what his demented daughter has done. For that knowledge, the sister knows, would kill him. When Philip Marlowe, unsatisfied by what he has found out, leaves the client's mansion, he passes this judgment on the brutal murder because he realizes that all of us eventually end up exactly like the victim. What did it matter where you lay once you were dead? In a dirty sump or in a marble tower on a high hill? You were dead. Oil and water were the same as wind and air to you. You just slept the big sleep, not caring about the nastiness of how you died or where you fell. As I hope Raymond Chandler makes clear here, the world of American detective fiction is much darker, more violent, much nastier, and altogether more irrational than the world of English detective fiction. Now, in the time that remains to me, let me turn to a world that is brighter, happier, more rational, and much more satisfying, at least to me, than the one I have just been talking about. Let me at last focus on my favorite novel, Pride and Prejudice. Before I begin to talk about why I feel this way, I think it is worth mentioning that Jane Austen originally called the book First Impressions, a title I slightly prefer because it identifies how much all of us are dependent on what we initially think of a person, and of course, on what that person thinks of us. For in the world of Pride and Prejudice, and in our own world as well, first impressions can be altogether accurate, or they can be very wrong indeed. The heroine of the novel, Elizabeth Bennet, is often exactly right in her first impressions of a character. She can tell immediately, both from his letter to her father and from his behavior when he comes to visit the Bennets at Longbourn, that Mr. Collins is a vain ass. Similarly, she recognizes the worth of Bingley as he is falling in love with her sister Jane because he speaks openly and honestly about what he feels, particularly about his concern for Jane when her sickness confines her in his house. But because characters in this world may appear different than they really are, Elizabeth is sometimes wrong in judging particular people, as she is initially and for quite a lengthy period of time afterwards about both the hero and the villain of the novel. The reasons for her errors, however, result from two very different causes. Because it is difficult to evaluate what Elizabeth early in the book calls intricate characters, she can be deceived by such people either by conscious deception or by her own hasty judgment based on too little evidence. The first kind of error she makes with Wickham, the villain of the work, who uses his charm, good looks, and practiced lies to manipulate her when he gives her a false account of Darcy's abuse of him. The second kind of error Elizabeth makes at a dance near the beginning of the novel, when she overhears Darcy, Bingley's shy but also handsome, rich, and self-important friend, refuse to dance with anyone but the only two women he knows there. When Bingley presses him, suggesting that he dance with Elizabeth, whom Bingley describes as very pretty, Darcy coldly replies, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." She is not being danced with at the time Bingley suggests that he dance with her. Overhearing this exchange, Elizabeth watches Darcy walk off while she remains seated, as Jane Austen ironically writes, with no very cordial feelings towards him. Whether Darcy, Bingley's friend, would actually make such a statement within hearing distance of Elizabeth is debatable. Some critics, in fact, claim that he would never say such a thing, since its rudeness is basically out of character for him. But even people as well-bred as Darcy, in a place where he is very uncomfortable and wishes to leave, might make such an uncharacteristic judgment. What really matters about this moment at the dance is that it affects everything that Elizabeth sees Darcy say or do for the whole first half of the novel. So even when his first impression of her changes, and he finds himself in the early stages of falling in love with her, she is perfectly unaware of these alterations in him. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable to no one and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. Her evaluation of Darcy here suggests how her sense of his character has been shaped almost entirely by her first impression of him. And that impression later proves to be misguided, as Elizabeth, racked by self-criticism, recognizes after she carefully studies a letter he writes to her after she has rejected his marriage proposal. How despicably I have acted. I, who have prided myself on my discernment. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation. Till this moment, I never knew myself. Offended by Darcy's initial neglect of her, Elizabeth has essentially misjudged his character. In writing about this novel, Tony Tanner argues that it focuses, among other things, on what constitutes a person's character. This suggests, he continues, the particular importance of first impressions because they constitute the beginning of experience and the reminder that first impressions, indeed all impressions, may need subsequent revision is only to say that full human life is a complex affair, and Jane Austen makes us well aware of this complexity. In Pride and Prejudice, such complexity is apparent as early as the famous opening sentence, which is not nearly as clear as it first seems. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. For, as Dorothy Van Ghent points out, what we need to read in this statement is its opposite. A single woman must be in want of a man with good fortune. And the word want here has substantially different connotations for different people. For a not very attractive 27-year-old woman with no fortune, like Elizabeth's friend Charlotte Lucas, that want touches on desperation. But for the beautiful 21-year-old Jane, Elizabeth's sister, want is still present, but it is more directly connected to personal desire. Her want is likely to mean a choice between more than one eligible man and to involve genuine feelings of love. Almost as complex as the word want in this opening sentence is the phrase universally acknowledged, because universally has a very limited reference to a particular social class, obviously not the poor, and much more to women than to men of good fortune. The world of Pride and Prejudice, like our own then, must be constantly evaluated because of its complexity. In it, surfaces, like the apparent content of this crucial opening sentence, may not be what they first seem. All of which brings me back to my choice of this novel as the center of a talk about books that have shaped my world. Why then is Pride and Prejudice my favorite novel? And I may be the only man in America who feels that way. There are many answers to this question, and I plan to explain at least some of them as I proceed. But the most obvious explanation is simple. I'm in love with Elizabeth Bennet. I find everything about her attractive. She is witty, loving, athletic, and socially adept. In addition, she has strikingly bright eyes and is very good looking, though not quite beautiful like her sister Jane. And she is very intelligent, but not wise. Since early in the book, she is much too quick to think she is right about almost everything. Even though she is immediately deceived by Wickham's good looks and charming manner, and she never really comprehends the desperate situation that her relatively unattractive best friend, Charlotte Lucas, faces. Nor does she notice the early change in Darcy's attitude toward her. because his initial behavior has rightly offended her. As a result, what she feels for him is something very like hatred, clearly expressed when he proposes to her halfway through the novel. To that proposal, she answers, "I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry." Her rejection here of the richest man in the novel, when she has almost no money and will never have more than a pittance unless she marries well, shows that Elizabeth is very independent-minded. She is also, in this case, very wrong, as she eventually understands after Darcy writes her a letter explaining why the two crucial charges she has leveled against him during his proposal are faulty. Before I discuss Darcy's letter and Elizabeth's response to it, however, let me pause at the turning point of the novel to talk about how Pride and Prejudice has helped shape my world. I attended an all-male college where I was wonderfully happy and had a number of great teachers, all of them men. So my education in this all-male world, as good as it was severely limited. In 4 years, as an English major who took as many English courses as I could find, I read one female writer, just one, Emily Dickinson. As a consequence, my perspective on life was skewed. I learned almost nothing about a woman's point of view on any issue. I did take an excellent Shakespeare class, which I loved, and in which I encountered brilliant, complex, and very interesting women. For the most part, though, the focus of my attention in Shakespeare's work during my college years was on his men. Because of the limits of my education, that was the way I thought. My experience in graduate school changed my perspective radically. For in my first year there, I read, among others, the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen. And I was particularly impressed by Pride and Prejudice, partly, as I have already said, because I fell in love with Elizabeth Bennet, but also because I recognized in the plot of the novel a pattern I had seen in Shakespearean comedies like Much Ado, and also in 30s movies like His Girl Friday and Bringing Up Baby. A love relationship between a man and a woman that begins in hostility and tension, but ends in love and marriage. What I realized about Pride and Prejudice was that it provided a tie between Shakespearean comedy and some of the films I liked best. In a sense, Jane Austen had borrowed from Shakespeare and provided the model for romantic comedies, my favorite kind of movies, simply because I like stories that end happily better than those that end sadly or tragically. I cannot adequately explain this response, and my wife teases me about my fondness for such films because she finds them too predictable, which may be exactly why I like them. I have long wondered why so many of my favorite books and films are romantic comedies, which not surprisingly is reflected even in my written work on Shakespeare. Of course, I love to teach almost all of his plays, but my published work has focused exclusively on his comedies. After years of thinking about this question and why it is that I'm so fond of romantic comedies, I still have no clear answer to it. The closest I can come to an explanation is that my parents went through a bitter and ugly divorce when I was 12, and that divorce tore my world apart. Perhaps since then, I subconsciously want books, movies, and life to end happily, as it does in Pride and Prejudice and in films like Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday. After this explanation for my taste for happy endings, let me return now to Darcy's letter to Elizabeth. For in it, he explains away the two major charges she has leveled against him while rejecting his proposal. First, he answers Elizabeth's accusation that he has directly interfered with Jane's love of Bingley, which he does do. He writes that Jane's very guarded appearance had led him to believe that her interest in Bingley showed not love, but only a polite degree of indifference. However amiable her temper, he says, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. Then he continues, logically asserting, I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction as truly as I wished it in reason. Darcy, therefore, has felt no guilt about spiriting his friend away from a woman, much beneath his social rank, with whom Bingley was falling deeply in love, and who seemed to Darcy not really romantically interested in Bingley. As the anger Elizabeth initially feels for Darcy because of what he has done to Jane very slowly subsides, she remembers her friend Charlotte's earlier warning about the way Jane keeps her feelings hidden from what Elizabeth calls the suspicions of the impertinent. Always the realist. Charlotte has argued it is sometimes a disadvantage to be so guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. Note that Charlotte here, unlike Elizabeth, is talking about the possibility of marriage in a very different way than Elizabeth has talked about it. Charlotte's phrase, fixing him, recognizes that the aim of a single woman is not so much to fall in love as it is to secure a man who will provide comfortably for her. That is what marriage means to Charlotte, and why, when she is offered the opportunity, she accepts the proposal of the vain, foolish, stupid, subservient, and self-important Mr. Collins. She knows she will never receive another proposal. And at least by accepting him, she will be settled in a comfortable house and escape being a lasting burden to her parents. In addition, she wisely encourages Collins to pursue his favorite hobby, working in his garden, so that she will at least sometimes be free of his bothersome attention. Beneath the surface of this novel, with its concern for dances, dinners, visits, walks in the country, and polite conversation, lies what Dorothy Van Ghent identifies as a barbaric subsurface of marital warfare. For many of the unmarried women in this world are engaged in a manhunt, upon which their survival in a comfortable social position depends. Different women respond to this situation in different ways. Charlotte, 27 years old and not very attractive, is clearly desperate to find a husband, while Elizabeth, 7 years younger and much more attractive, has a very different attitude. But her attitude is unusual. For example, Charlotte, who first recognizes that Darcy may actually be in love with Elizabeth, never doubts that if he proposes, she will accept his offer. How could she not, since Darcy is handsome, intelligent, perceptive, at the richest man in the novel. And if she married him, Elizabeth would become the mistress of a great estate in Derbyshire, something that she later recognizes with some degree of sadness when she visits Pemberley, Darcy's home. Nor does Darcy doubt that Elizabeth will accept his proposal. After all, he's the most eligible bachelor in this world. It is therefore no surprise that his proposal, focused as much on the inferiority of her connections as on his love for her, angers rather than pleases Elizabeth. One of her responses to this proposal, as Darcy later admits, changes his very view of himself because it calls into question his essential nature. When she almost immediately rejects his offer, this is before she gives the specific reasons, he argues that her response, marked by so little endeavor of civility, results from his justifiable description of her social inferiority to him. To answer this challenge, Elizabeth directs two charges at Darcy. First, that he has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a beloved sister. And second, that he has reduced Wickham, a soldier whom she admires, to his present state of comparative poverty. Then she continues, and these words call into question Darcy's very sense of self-worth. You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your direct declaration affected me in any other way than it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Long having taken for granted because of his birth, education, and wealth that he is a gentleman, Darcy recognizes the truth of Elizabeth's claim here, as he explains to her much later in the novel, after he has proposed a second time, and she has immediately, though not very fluently, accepted his proposal. At this moment of complete happiness for them both, Darcy explains to Elizabeth the power of her earlier reproof. You know not, you can scarcely conceive how your words have tortured me. A few sentences earlier, Darcy has admitted that he deserved the brutal criticism of him. What did you say of me that I did not deserve? For though your accusations were ill-founded, my behavior to you at the time had merited the severest reproof. It was unpardonable. Darcy's remark here takes me back to a claim I made a few minutes ago, that I would talk about his answer to her second charge against him, that he has brought Wickham to his present state of comparative poverty. What Darcy's letter makes absolutely clear to Elizabeth is that Wickham has misrepresented himself to her in almost everything he claims about his situation. He has proven to be a liar and a fortune hunter, and the easy and comfortable manners he has shown to Elizabeth are just part of his repertory for deceiving people in order to take advantage of them. In fact, Wickham's later seduction of and flight with Lydia, Elizabeth's youngest sister, whom he does not intend to marry, he proves himself to be more than deceptive, for he is the source of genuine evil in the novel. And against such evil, only Darcy has the wealth and power to eliminate the threat Wickham poses, not only to Lydia, but also to the reputation of the whole Bennet family. This he does because he still loves Elizabeth. This is between the time he proposes the first and the second time. even though in earlier refusing his proposal, she has claimed he is the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. The world of Pride and Prejudice, as Elizabeth's statement to Darcy makes clear here, is rife with irony. After all, Darcy marries a woman he initially judges not attractive enough to dance with. And Elizabeth joyfully accepts the proposal of someone she once thought was the last man in the world she would wish to marry. In the realm of comedy, characters make mistakes and then have a chance to correct their errors. In the world of tragedy, a character's mistakes have cataclysmic results, which is why, finally, I prefer reading comedies more than tragedies. For comedies end happily, even if they usually, before their endings, move us toward near disasters. Pride and Prejudice takes us in that direction and then magically turns us back to happiness. In fact, it is possible to say of this work, behind its many complications, that it tells a very simple story about a man who changes his manners and a woman who changes her mind. That is, of course, a simplistic reduction of a very great novel, but it is also, to some degree, true. So after this brief journey touching upon the complexity of my favorite novel and smiling at the comedy of life it confirms, I thank you for coming to listen to my version of the books that have shaped my world. My lifelong reading experience has been wide-ranging, richly rewarding, and often fun. Thanks for letting me share it with you.
Thank you, Dr. Huston. My name is Julie Jamalini Connor, for those of you who don't know me. Along with Natalie and Victor, I serve on the board of Friends of Fondren Library. And thank you for coming this evening. I want to say a few things first, and then we'll go to questions and answers. My first week of my freshman year at Rice, I noticed a flyer on a bulletin board somewhere that said they were casting for Hello Hamlet. I had no idea what Hello Hamlet was, but I had been in high school drama plays, and my roommate also, Becky Green, who many of you know from Main Street Theater. So I more or less dragged Becky over to these tryouts, and we ended up being in the chorus, we'll call it, of Hello Hamlet. So from that, let's say my earliest days at Rice were involved with Shakespeare. And of course, along the way, I heard about this very famous and funny professor teaching Shakespeare. So as I went on my degree in English, junior year, I signed up for this course. And unfortunately, halfway through my junior year, I dropped out, so I didn't get to finish the year. But along that way, again, I had the opportunity to see Dr. Huston act in Shakespeare. And I have an indelible memory of him sitting on the stage in one of those comedies holding a banana. And I hesitate to demonstrate what he did with that banana. I will let your imaginations take hold. I don't know if he used that gesture and that particular prop over and over again, but it was effective. So Shakespeare ran through my years at Rice. One of the reasons I love these lectures is because even though I sat in class with him 3 times a week for an hour for a semester, you still come here and you learn things about the professor. Who would think that his favorite novel would be Pride and Prejudice? I have to tell you, several years ago, PBS ran a thing with its audience to vote on their favorite novel of all time. Any novel, any country, anywhere. I actually voted for my favorite novel. I'm a Southerner raised in Louisiana in the country, and my favorite novel is To Kill a Mockingbird. But my second vote, because I think you got to vote for like 5-3, my second vote was for Pride and Prejudice. I knew why I liked Pride and Prejudice, but it's just so amazing to me that my esteemed Shakespearean professor also prefers that novel. It's an amazing, and how he analyzed it, yes. The classic story, you start out hating someone and you end up loving them. It's true, but you have to see the pattern, and it takes a certain kind of mind to see that pattern. So I think we've all been blessed with having teachers like Dr. Huston in our lives. And I hope you will have the opportunity at the reception after this to share with him how he has affected your own lives. So we're going to go to the question and answers now. I think we have one microphone back here, and I will pass my microphone around.
And it's okay if there aren't any.
I want to go back to the earlier part of your presentation about crime fiction.
Right.
What do you make of all the popular Scandinavian crime fiction? I'll say I read one of those books, and it was so dark and so violent, I couldn't read any more of them.
I certainly understand that response because that's exactly my wife's response. It is interesting that somebody who has chosen Pride and Prejudice as his favorite novel should not be turned off by the violence of, say, those Scandinavian novels. But I like them too. It's true that I don't read them late at night in a room by myself. But I do love them. Yeah.
Continuing on talking about detective fiction, I thought it was very interesting your contrast between the British detective fiction and the American. But almost all detective fiction seems to involve a murder, not some other crime. Are there any detective fiction books that don't involve murder that you're particularly fond of?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it because there are at least detective novels. Ross MacDonald, for instance, writes sometimes about something else that's missing, a book or, something. And it's clear it's been stolen somehow, and that the detective goes and tries to find it. Often, as I talk about with Raymond Chandler, in the process of looking for it, he discovers other murders. But in Ross MacDonald, often he goes back 2 and sometimes 3 generations to follow a pattern that then expresses itself in the present that he has started in. So that my sense is that as someone who's read a lot of Ross MacDonald, but none recently, I think that at least some of those novels begin where what's missing is not a person, but a thing of real importance.
What current mystery writers are you reading now?
I like one of the terrible things about, I had a stroke about 20 years ago and my memory is screwed up. I like Michael Connelly best of all, probably best. I like Michael Connelly and Lisa Scottoline. Those are the two I think of, though there's a wonderful novelist who was an actress for a while, I think, and she's written books, I can't remember, but she's won a number of prizes, and I think she's Irish, and she's really wonderful. Anybody know who it is? I'm sorry about my what? Yes. Yes, thank you. Ton of French. Great books. Though the most recent one I'm reading disappoints me. But that's the only one that's disappointed me.
The collective memory is strong.
So I have a question for you, Dennis. So
Yeah.
you said you read Pride and Prejudice multiple times.
Right.
So sort of two parts of that. One is there a particular anniversary day where you go, this is my Pride and Prejudice rereading day? And do you get something, what do you get that's different the next, each time when you read it?
That's a very good, that's a wonderful question, because mostly when I read it again for fun on my own, it's not different. I know what's going to happen, and I just love reading about that happening. Now, the voices are wonderful in that novel, as I tried to capture at least some of them when I was reading out loud today. And so what I do is I go back to the novel to spend time with Elizabeth Bennet, and because I think the story's so wonderful, though different things in the novel strike me in different ways. When I teach it, that's a different experience, because the people who are in the class are seeing something different from what other people in the class have seen and from what I've seen. So that when, as you know well, when you're teaching something, you learn all sorts of new things because of what students have to say about what you're talking about or getting ready to talk about, or finessing when you realize their ideas are better than yours. Yeah.
I remember a few years ago, you taught a class on your favorite.
Sorry, we want to get you on the tape.
A few years ago, you taught a class on your favorite novels.
You bet.
I remember that Pride and Prejudice was one of them.
You bet.
What were the others?
Great Expectations, which is the very first novel I read in my life that made me cry, was A Tale of Two Cities. And Dickens, that was 8th grade. Dickens, and I remember I read it late at night, and I'd been reading for a long time, and I was tired, and the end came, and I didn't see it coming, and I just wept. I laid my head on my bed and wept. And in fact, Dickens was somebody I wrote a senior thesis on as an undergraduate because I liked him so much. So I did Great Expectations, I did Pride and Prejudice, I did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Atonement, which is the other novel I thought about doing in this lecture. That one of the choices I made as I thought about the lecture was, will I do Atonement or will I do Pride and Prejudice? And I finally decided, for obvious reasons, those of you know Atonement, which is the best novel I've read in the last 10 years, that it is as dark as it gets. When you talk about somebody making a cataclysmic mistake that cannot be undone, that's what Atonement is about. And the person who makes the cataclysmic mistake is about 12 years old. And it results in the death of somebody and of other people as well.
Maybe
And-
one more question. I saw.
So the other books by Jane Austen, what do you think of them? I thought several were very formulaic after having read Pride and Prejudice.
I
hated Emma.
That's the one I like best. Of all the other books by Jane Austen, that's the one I like best.
Well, the book ended up fine, but I hated Emma in the.
Oh, well, I can understand that. I feel the same way. I was telling somebody earlier who asked me what Shakespeare play I liked the least. And I said, that's a hard question to answer, but The great Shakespeare play I like the least is Macbeth, which I've taught many, many times, but I dislike it because I dislike everybody in the play. And that I can certainly understand your response to Emma, because she screws up a lot of people's lives before everything ends happy.
We have one more question back here.
Have you read any Josephine Tey?
Yes, but only you know, the answer to that question is I should have read a lot, but I get sidetracked. You know, I have to teach, things like that. The one I've read is the one about Richard III,
Yeah.
which is a brilliant novel, and I loved it. I think she's a great writer. Yeah. It's interesting. I have people out of order in that list of novels that I said, you know, when I read Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and Ross MacDonald and Dick Francis, and I stick him at the end of the American section, but he's an English writer. He's an English detective writer who writes American detective fiction, in the sense that his world is a world that I describe that's very much like Raymond Chandler. Thank you all.